Looks like this thing needs a new alternator, among many other things. So let's just dive right in. We'll take the negative battery terminal off and shove it down to the side where it can't touch anything. Sprinkles. This plastic shield should have a clip here, 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 and here. They're pretty simple. You just take a screwdriver, pry up the middle, and then you can pull the clip out. Previous owner hooked out on this one and just ripped them all off, so there are no clips on this car. I'll take the engine cover off so you can see all the greasy goodness. Mako, America's Body Shop. This is the alternator here. We've got two electrical connections to worry about. Here's the ground lug. There's just a 10mm nut. And then the squeezy tab connector down here. There are 3 bolts we have to remove to get the alternator out. The first one is down here under the exhaust heat shield. It's that greasy one right there. It's a 12mm. The second one is this big one up here. This one is a 14mm. The third and final bolt is down here. It's a little tough to see, so I put my socket wrench on there to help locate it. This one's also a 14mm. In order to get it from the top, you have to come up here and take off a bunch of stuff, including the thermostat housing and the upper radiator hose, which, I don't know, I think it's easier to take the wheel off. Only an idiot jacks up a car on a hill like this. Unfortunately, I don't have a flat space to work, so maybe if my safety precautions fail, I can total both of these cars at once. On these front-wheel drive Toyotas, I like to put the jack under this front subframe mount here. It's a nice and easy to find, and it leaves your pinch weld here completely free to put the jack stand under. Even though the weight of the car is on the stand, I'm still going to leave the jack under here as a redundancy. I'm going to go ahead and take this passenger wheel off to give me better access to the belt tensioner as well as that third bolt I showed you earlier. Zip off these two 10mm bolts to rip off the splash shield. Pro tip for working in the field, get yourself one of these lock-in cases with little compartments. It's great for storing all the bolts in so you don't lose them. It's also good because you can go in reverse order and see exactly what you did in exactly the right order, and you'll know if you missed any bolts. Here's that third bolt. I had to use a deep socket to get it off, but you can't get it all the way out because your ratchet will get pinched between the bolt and the frame and you'll get it stuck. So you have to switch to a shallow socket. I'm going to go ahead and relieve the tension from this dynamic belt tensioner. You just need a 14mm box end wrench or a crow's foot like I have. We're going to have to do this to get the belt off the alternator, but it also makes it easier to get that third bolt out when you don't have the tensioner tensioned. Stick an Allen key in here to lock the belt tensioner in its relieved position. You're going to have to do just a little bit of work to free up this wiring loom to get the alternator out. It's also going to make access to this bolt much easier. First, we'll take off the ground lug by removing the 10mm nut. Then slide back this little rubber boot to get the connector off. It's a little squeezy right there. Just squeeze it and pull. To free up this part of the loom, we either need to pry off this plastic retainer or take the 10mm bolt out. I'm going to go with the bolt because these plastic retainers tend to snap with age. Same exact situation up here on the valve cover. Now that the wiring loom is nice and free, we have access to this big 14mm bolt up top. Just reach on in here with your socket extension and your 12mm socket to take off this first bolt down under the heat shield. Before you try yanking the alternator out, unplug this connector going to the AC compressor and undo this little squeeze tab here holding it into this bracket. On second thought, that squeeze tab is going to be impossible to get out. Let's take this 10mm bolt out and remove the entire bracket instead. Take the path of least resistance. Now with the hardware and the wiring out of the way, the old alternator should pry out with just a little bit of persuasion. Unfortunately, we're going to have to make some room to get the alternator physically out of the car. This bracket's going to come off. It's just a bunch of 10mm, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. It's not that big a deal. You've also got 2 holding this air duct in and 1 sneaky little bugger under there we got to get out. You also need to go ahead and take out the bolts holding the hood latch in. This top radiator support's almost ready to come out. We either need to unbolt the horns or just disconnect them. We're going to disconnect them. There's one over here and a second one over here. Slip the hood release cable out from this little retainer, and out she comes. Mako! Some people say you have to take the radiator out to get the alternator out, but that's BS. All you got to do is move it a little bit. Just undo this 10mm bolt down here and the other one down here, and that gives you plenty of play to squeeze the alternator out. I did cave and take the upper radiator hose off and made a little puddle in the driveway, but you know what? It made it a lot easier. I put that big top bolt back in the alternator to give me something to grab onto. And out she comes, nice and greasy. Let's go put it over here next to the new one and make sure everything looks the same. Here's the new alternator from Advanced Auto Parts. Looks like the pulleys line up just right, the mounting points are identical, the electrical connections are the same, and the only thing we have to swap over is this L bracket right here. It bolts onto the new one right here. Carefully lower the new alternator back in the same way the old one came out. Install the bolt that's under the exhaust. Then install the bolt that's up on the top. Don't torque any of them until you're certain you've got all three started, then you go and torque them. Hook the belt back over just so we don't lose it. Here's another shot of that tricky third bolt down here. Start tightening it with a shallow socket so your ratchet will fit, and then once you can squeeze in your deep socket, use that to torque it down fully. And yes, I know this belt needs to be replaced, but I'm too busy making a video. So take your 14mm, put a little torque on that spring tensioner so you can pull out your hex key and put tension back on the belt. Now you can go ahead and fully tighten the 3 bolts that hold the alternator in. Reinstall the 10mm bolt that holds this bracket in and plug your AC compressor back in. Now it's time to bolt back in the wiring harness retainers, 10mm on the front and the 10mm up on the valve cover. Plug back in the alternator and reinstall the ground lug. This one came with a nice new shiny 10mm nut. Slip the upper radiator hose back onto the thermostat housing, and be prepared to check your coolant level because it's probably going to be a little bit low depending on how much spilled. Reinstall the 2 10mm bolts that hold the bottom of the radiator in. Hook the hood release cable back into its retainer. Get the upper radiator support back into position. We'll bolt in the hood latch, 2 10mm bolts that you took out earlier. Go ahead and plug your horns back in, both left and right. Bolt back in your air duct assembly. This is why I work on all my own cars, so I can't blame the previous mechanic for the crap I find. And do up the 5 10mm bolts holding the upper radiator support in. Zip your little splash shield back in. Pop the engine cover back on. You've got 2 female ends here and 2 male ends on the valve cover. Just slip it on there and pound it in. Put the plastic panel back on, and if you broke any of the clips taking them off, replace them, you cheapskate. As much as I love sprinkles, this is a bit excessive. It's very important in life to always stay grounded. Thanks for watching.